You've been living in a dream world, Neo. This is the world as it exists today.
Then comes the major surgery, the removal of the man and the formation of the woman.
A new life is begun.
So that was Edward's classic, Glenn or Glenda. It's about a man named Glenn going through a bit of a crisis of character because he has to explain to his wife that he isn't a homosexual, he just likes to dress up sometimes. You may know of this film or the director from the film, Ed Wood.
Really? Worst film you ever saw?
Why am I talking about a movie that's a B movie from the 1950s about cross-dressing? Well, according to Keith Howes, it's the first time anyone ever said the word transsexual on screen. And that's because there's a bit tacked on the end of Glenn or Glenda, which is about this trans woman named Anne. Now, Anne used to be a World War II veteran, but is now wanting to get a sex change operation. What sparked this random fascination with trans people at the time? Well, Glenn or Glenda was released in 1953, the same year that Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, and the same year that the USSR got their hands on a working hydrogen bomb. But more importantly, it's the same year that this was released.
A 26-year-old ex-GI arrives home from Denmark where doctors converted him into a woman. 2 years ago, the name was George Jorgensen. Today, it's Christine.
She's an actual World War II veteran who went on to become a trans icon of the 20th century. A lot of people's first interactions with what it meant to be transgender was this woman. Now, she's not the first person to ever get bottom surgery, but she was the first person to have it so publicly out there. And you can tell by her closing remarks that she's just tired of this.
I don't have any plans at the moment, and I thank you all for coming, but I think it's too much. Fine, thank you very much.
But people had to know. And honestly, not much has changed. Yes, considerable progress has been made in terms of trans rights since the 1950s, but there's always been a weird fascination from cis people about trans people and trans bodies. Politicians and political parties haven't really been able to make their mind up on whether or not they're actually friends with this 0.5% fragment of the population.
I will do everything in my power to protect our LGBTQ citizens.
Trans people still face indignities and prejudice when they deserve understanding and respect.
On day one, I will immediately sign a new executive order to cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, transgender insanity.
And we shouldn't get bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want to be. They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
Transgender precedents are going to be saying that a transgender woman is a woman and should be allowed on a female ward. What if one of them was sitting here and said that to you, what would be your response?
Well, I disagree. I disagree.
So how are these constantly changing attitudes reflected on screen? In my research, I'm going to study trans history on screen decade by decade. And in each decade, there will be 3 case studies that I'm going to take a look at. There will always be a piece of media with a liberal or progressive attitude to trans people for the time, but with no trans people in a head of department role. So no writer, no director, no producer, etc. B, a piece of media with a conservative or anti-trans attitude for the time. Again, with no trans people in an HOD role. And then finally C, a piece of media with a trans person in an HOD role, giving them agency to sit at the table and say, no, I disagree, or actually let's do it this way. So I may bend the rules from time to time, but this is the main criteria that I'm following. The main aim is to study the recent past in order to understand the present and the future. So what's the first decade that I'm covering? Now, I love Silence of the Lambs as most other horror lovers out there do, but it's safe to say that its representation of transgender people or transsexuals doesn't exactly hold up. Now, we all know Buffalo Bill, the killer that Clarice and Hannibal take down through an uneasy alliance. Now, Buffalo Bill is almost an homage to the character of Norman Bates. The way Sight and Sound at the time puts it is that all of these movies from the 70s were missing that real world je ne sais quoi, the extra psychological dimension with connections to sex, violence, fears of castration, and misogyny. It's a return to form narrative made by cis people for cis people. Buffalo Bill is a great character to package all of those fears into. Bill is created in a way to embody the misogyny demonstrated in the rest of the film. He's in the narrative as the final form of misogyny, and how does one transition as a psychotic serial killer? Well, Bill's method, of course, is
to skin his humps.
Because
he's making himself a woman's suit, Mr. Crawford, out of real women.
In my opinion, this methodology that Bill uses is reminiscent of current Earth talking points, like J.K. Rowling's recent statement that a certain trans woman was cosplaying a misogynistic male fantasy of what a woman is. Although it's very similar to Psycho in packaging these fears in a disturbed genderqueer character, it does try to avoid demonizing trans people. Kind of.
Our belly wants to change too.
There's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
So the narrative accepts and encourages the audience to not see Bill as a realistic vision of a trans character. But in this statement it sets a weird tonal message about what trans women have to be in order to be recognised as women. Transness is given a narrow definition that involves being passive in a world where you kind of have to fight to survive. And two cisgender psychologists confirming whether or not someone is a real trans makes sense within the narrative, but it's frustrating to watch with the context that in the real world trans people are often denied their healthcare due to bigotry from healthcare workers rather than a legitimate medical assessment.
Several years ago, I went to my GP, told her I'm trans, and asked to be referred to a gender identity clinic. The first thing she did was refuse. Not exactly off to a great start.
Alrighty then. Did he ever tell you you were beautiful? All the time. Even now. What do you mean?
I don't know what the director's intentions were in making this film. I suspect he did want to create an empathetic portrayal of a trans woman. But in the same way that Psycho created this ripple effect of cross-dressing psychopathic serial killers, The Crying Game created a ripple effect of men reacting with vomiting when they see a transgender woman.
Would he have minded?
You did know, didn't you? Oh, my God. Jesus, I feel sick. Don't go, Jimmy. I'm sorry. I thought you knew.
Oh, and I'm not crazy about the name change. What is it, like Danielle or Dana? No, Ida.
Pay no attention to these hypocrites, Neo. To deny our own impulses is to deny the very thing that makes us human.
Cyberpunk! A subgenre with no universally agreed upon definition, but is seen to feature high technology.
I know Kung Fu.
Show me.
That's then used by anti-establishment characters. And how did the Wachowskis make the genre their own?
It's about robots versus Kung Fu.
Besides that.
What's interesting about the whole idea of cyberpunk is that it's a great way to create a sense of alienation and disconnection.
And why might they want to make a movie that expresses those feelings? Well, the closeted explanation would be something like...
It's always a difficult thing to ask anybody, where do you get your ideas from? Nobody knows, they just sort of happen.
And a later explanation would be...
Being out and trans forces people to look back on my work and apply a trans narrative to it. Because I wasn't making the Matrix films as specifically trans narratives. One of the most striking things to me is the burbling undercurrent of rage that I felt and not being able to be who I was.
And the sisters were also very well read.
We like Japanimation.
And there was one Japanese animation that shared similar themes, both visually and philosophically.
They showed me this animated Japanese cartoon, and they said, we want to do that for real.
A transhumanist narrative about overcoming biological limitations, but also shared an undercurrent of rage, and a subversion of the gender binary. On a personal note, these films were both incredibly impactful on me growing up. Despite their bleak settings, the undertone of a freedom to be who you truly are spoke to my closeted trans self. Anyway,
I've got a chick's body!
Isn't a lack of a father the reason you hate trans people?
What? Lack of a father? Man, you hear yourself? Shut up.
The fuck are you looking at? Who are you?
I'm Jules. I'm a friend of...
You're a friend of whose? Because you're not my fucking friend. Who the fuck are you friends with, Jules?
So Jules is a step up from the 90s for one very clear reason. She isn't
Very passive.
You have no fucking idea! Fucking Christ, you're psycho!
I think you're a fucking faggot, just like your daddy.
But that isn't with some trial and error at the writing stage. In the original pilot script by Sam Levinson, Jules is seen to be a somewhat hornier, somewhat non-passing trans woman, with no qualms of being labelled as a femboy on dating apps. Whilst the final product of the show did have a good look into a trans woman's dependency on male validation to feel feminine, the initial script reads more like a soulless, two-dimensional characterization of a trans woman. It took someone like Hunter Schafer to actually steer the ship there and make a somewhat two-dimensional character feel like a realistic, three-dimensional trans woman. And this is so evident when she's given a chance to write an episode.
I feel like I've framed my entire womanhood around men. When, like, in reality, I'm no longer interested in men. Like, philosophically. Like what men want. Like, what men want is so boring and simple and not creative, and, like, I look at myself and I'm like, how the fuck did I spend my entire life building this, like my body and my personality and like my soul around what I think men desire.
This deep dive and retrospect look into Jules' character shared similar ideas to the works of people like Judith Butler.
We're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world.
Yeah, I'm here, but you're looking at like a million layers of other people that I've grabbed and clung to throughout my entire life.
Jules ultimately grew and developed as a character when let loose from a cisgender auteur-style grasp. She also proved why the trans perspective on trans characters not only makes these characters more believable, but enriches the narrative as a result. Unlike...
I'm Rayo.
Oh, well, I don't know what that means, but I'll take that as a compliment. There's always one drunkard out there somewhere having a fun. Yes. What's your point? What are you heckling about? Incredible. Well, what do you mean by that? What problem do you have with, because I'm a man, I don't deserve to play that part?
My issue with cisgender men playing trans women, what it does is it perpetuates a stereotype that at the end of the day, I take this off. That somehow I'm not a woman because that's what these men do. They put it on and play a character, and then they're given an award, but with a beard.
Incredible.
And people think, oh, that's what trans is.
As men with really good hair and makeup and costume. And that's reinforced every time we see a man who's played a trans woman off screen.
Incredible.
So outside of failing to break that habit of trans roles going to men hungry for an Oscar, the film maintained another traditional view.
Transsexuals are very passive.
While Rayan was sassy, she ultimately did nothing to better her condition. That was always up to the cowboy. Rayon was never real in the actual Dallas Buyers Club story. She was invented as a catalyst for the screenplay, not a driving force of any real action within the film.
Your lips are so...
Sense8 is on the list for one particular reason. It exists. Nomi isn't different in any way from the other protagonists, she simply exists. Signs of progress can often be the normalization of depictions on screen, and that normalcy can only really be authenticated by those for whom that walk of life is normal.
Well, I totally disagree with what you said about dropping LGBT. Hey, come on, relax. It's a party. We fought hard for that recognition.
I just thought that the distinctions were separating us.
Bullshit. Just another colonizing male trying to take up any space left to women.
Sam, say one more thing about my girlfriend and I will colonize your face with my fist.
I'm crying because no one's ever defended me before.
Did you hear what they called me?
Yeah.
Do you want to ask me about it?
Do you want me to ask you about it?
No.
I met this trans woman. You should see her. She's the most beautiful person you've ever met, and I just couldn't love her. And I see it now. I see what it was that I lost in her, and moreover, I see why I messed it up in the way that I did.
So this is immediately a step up from
Rayon.
In that Terry is based off and portrayed by a real trans woman. That missing layer of authenticity in biopics from previous decades can be found in this work based on just that alone. However, if I had to critique one thing, it would be that Terry is still a vessel for the protagonist to improve. This is done intentionally, with the writer and the biopic focus Richard Gadd reflecting on how they poorly treated his real-life trans partner. This is a minor critique at best. For the most part, this felt like a cis author's authentic and well-meaning attempt at writing a trans woman. Whilst it does fall into the same pitfalls as works like Dallas Buyers Club, it also shines in other ways. When Rayon seems depraved next to the victorious cowboy, Terry has no question of who she is, whilst Donnie is the one who is constantly spiraling. Terry is never seen as the one who's at fault. Donnie is.
It is so devastating to think of yourself as a progressive person, only to realize you're a coward underneath it all.
In a world where women's sports is being transformed, the Daily Wire calls foul with the most triggering comedy of the year. Lady Ballers.
Now, the boys down at the fairly notorious Daily Wire conservative media network were trying to cook up a new controversial documentary after the success that they had with...
What is a woman?
A documentary that mostly involved self-proclaimed theocratic fascist and Daily Wire commentator Matt Walsh harassing university professors and others for an answer. And they'd had an idea for a new documentary tackling the idea of trans people in sports. One small issue with their idea, though.
I originally went to them and I said, you guys should go try out for a bunch of ladies' leagues. And that became not possible because, as it turns out, most ladies' leagues don't allow in actual men. And they weren't willing to go the full distance in terms of what it would require in order to, the actual hormone treatments and everything to play in some of the ladies' leagues. But in any case, it turned into this. So explain.
Yeah, please do. For a media conglomerate that cares so much about facts and not feelings, it's bizarre to then create a false reality and then pass it off as contemporary political commentary. This made-up hypothetical about biological men dominating in women's sports has only gotten worse with time, as cisgender athletes are now getting bullied by prominent billionaire bigots at the last Olympics.
When I think about that stuff, it feels like someone took a shovel and dug out all of my insides, and I know there's nothing in there, but I'm still too nervous to open myself up and check. I know there's something wrong with me. My parents know it too, even if they don't say anything. Do you ever feel like that?
So I just saw the TV glow, and it was interesting. It reminded me of how I felt at a certain time. It was 2021. I just got out of uni, and I'd been exploring my gender identity, and it had taken a while to get to that step, but I needed a job. I needed to be normal. So I thought I'd go work for a certain coffee shop after a certain Moby Dick character. But I presented male to fit in. I knew people wouldn't understand if I presented feminine, so I blended in. Time slipped by, and I didn't feel great about this. I felt trapped. I felt numb, like the kind of numb where you're on your lunch break and you just hyperventilate. And then you go back to work. That is the feeling that I saw the TV glow nailed.
I'm sorry about before. Sorry about that before. Sorry.
What I want to see in the future in this industry for trans people in any capacity is just us being allowed in the audition, allowed again in the writers' rooms, allowed into the production offices, allowed behind the camera. If you want to create an authentic trans experience on film, involve trans people.